A victory for South African farmers and a reminder that we don't need to look overseas for solutions when we have the capacity right here at home. Now, for too long, our markets have been flooded with cheap and sometimes even bioengineered hormone-filled chicken from the United States and other European countries, mostly undermining our local farmers and threatening jobs and filling our plates with food that may not even be safe. Now, a Supreme Court of Appeal ruling has reaffirmed the legality of anti-dumping duties, protecting our poultry industry and hopefully our plates. But this is more than just a legal victory. It's a moment to ask, why were we even importing chicken when our farmers are more than capable?
No, online check has 66. There's no chicken. If chicken, guys. What's happening?
For the first time since the 1990s, China has not brought any U.S. soybeans any soybeans at the start of the export season. Instead, China has bought a large shipment from Brazil in what is being seen as a taunt to U.S. President Donald Trump. That is also a sign Beijing is seeking an edge by shunning U.S. soy and using agriculture as leverage in its trade fight with Washington. China has restored to a strategy it used during the first trade war. Beijing is now holding back on imports of soybeans from the U.S. Instead, China is buying from Brazil. Chinese imports have already purchased enough cargoes from Brazil to meet their demands for the remainder of the year. The strategy appears to be paying off. U.S. farmers are coping with prices near the lowest levels in years. Data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture shows China had not booked a single cargo as of September 11th. That is mostly 3 weeks into the new marketing season, marking the first time in records going back to 1990.
Africa's growing rejection of U.S. agricultural products has quietly evolved into one of the most consequential economic shifts in global trade, triggering billions of dollars in losses for American exporters while signaling a deeper transformation in Africa's food trade and sovereignty policies. What initially appeared as isolated regulatory disputes or temporary import suspensions has hardened into a continent-wide reassessment of dependency on foreign food systems. For decades, the United States positioned itself as a dominant supplier of agricultural commodities to African markets. Corn, wheat, soybeans, poultry, rice, dairy products, and processed foods flowed into Africa under trade programs, food aid frameworks, and bilateral agreements. These exports supported American farmers, stabilized surplus production, and anchored U.S. influence across African food systems. That arrangement is now under strain. African governments have increasingly imposed restrictions, tightened standards, delayed approvals, or outright rejected certain U.S. agricultural imports. The reasons vary by country, but the pattern is unmistakable. Food safety concerns, genetically modified organism regulations, pesticide residue limits, local farmer protection policies, and foreign exchange pressures have converged into a powerful pushback against U.S. farm dominance. The financial impact on the United States has been severe. Agricultural exports to Africa once represented one of the fastest-growing destinations for American farm goods. As access narrowed, U.S. exporters lost contracts, market share, and long-term growth opportunities. Industry estimates point to billions of dollars in lost revenue over recent years, affecting not only large agribusiness firms but also mid-sized producers across America's agricultural heartland. At the core of the dispute is control. African policymakers argued that reliance on imported food, particularly subsidized products from developed economies, has undermined domestic agriculture for decades. Cheap imports, they said, displaced local farmers, weakened food security, and locked countries into dependency cycles vulnerable to global price shocks. The rejection of U.S. products is increasingly framed as an act of economic self-defense rather than protectionism. One of the most contentious issues has been genetically modified crops. While GM products are widely accepted in the United States, many African nations maintain strict regulations or outright bans. Concerns range from environmental risks and seed sovereignty to the dominance of multinational biotech firms. Several U.S. exports have faced rejection or lengthy approval delays due to non-compliance with African biosafety frameworks. Poultry imports have been another flashpoint. American chicken exports, often sold at prices African producers cannot match, have faced anti-dumping measures, quotas, and bans in multiple countries. African governments argue these imports destroy local poultry industries, cost jobs, and prevent investment in domestic value chains. Grain exports have also suffered. Wheat and corn shipments from the U.S. have encountered competition not only from alternative suppliers but from African policy shifts favoring regional production and substitution. Governments increasingly prioritized local staples and regional trade over long-distance imports from North America. Food aid itself has become controversial. While U.S. food assistance once dominated humanitarian supply chains, African leaders and civil society groups have criticized models that ship American-grown food instead of sourcing locally or regionally. They argue this approach distorts markets and undermines long-term resilience. As aid frameworks evolve, U.S. agricultural shipments have declined. The rise of alternative partners has accelerated this shift. Africa now sources agricultural imports from a wider range of suppliers, including Latin America, Eastern Europe, Asia, and intra-African producers. This diversification reduces dependence on the United States and weakens Washington's leverage in agricultural trade negotiations. Domestic political pressures within Africa have reinforced the trend. Youth unemployment, rural poverty, and food price volatility have pushed governments to protect local farmers more aggressively. Agricultural policy has become a political issue tied to sovereignty, dignity, and national development. From Washington's perspective, the losses are not merely commercial. Agriculture has long been a tool of soft power. U.S. farm exports supported diplomatic relationships, stabilized alliances, and reinforced economic ties. As those exports decline, so does a key channel of influence. American agribusiness groups have warned that Africa's market retreat could have long-term consequences. Once supply chains shift, regaining market share becomes difficult. Infrastructure investments, consumer preferences, and regulatory alignment tend to lock in new trading patterns. The economic shock has rippled across U.S. farming communities. Reduced exports contribute to oversupply, lower prices, and financial stress, particularly for producers reliant on international markets. The losses are magnified by rising input costs and global competition. African leaders counter that the old model was unsustainable. Importing food while exporting raw materials created trade imbalances and external vulnerability. The rejection of U.S. products aligns with broader strategies promoting food sovereignty, industrial agriculture, and regional integration. The African Continental Free Trade Area has amplified these ambitions. By encouraging intra-African trade, the agreement reduces reliance on external suppliers. African producers increasingly see continental markets as the future, not distant exporters. Environmental and health standards have also played a role. African regulators have tightened controls on pesticide residues, antibiotic use, and processing standards. Some U.S. products failed to meet updated requirements, leading to shipment rejections and contract cancellations. The United States has pushed back diplomatically, arguing that restrictions lack scientific justification and violate trade principles. However, Africa's collective stance has made bilateral pressure less effective. Countries share information, coordinate standards, and learn from each other's regulatory experiences. What makes this shift historic is its scale. Africa is no longer a passive market. It is actively shaping its food systems in ways that prioritize domestic production, regional resilience, and policy autonomy. The billion-dollar losses reflect more than missed sales. They represent a structural change in global agricultural trade. The assumption that Africa would remain a captive growth market for U.S. agriculture is no longer valid. Some American firms have attempted adaptation by investing directly in African production, processing, and storage. These moves suggest recognition that export-led dominance is giving way to partnership-based models. The rejection of U.S. agricultural products has also intersected with geopolitics. As Africa asserts independence in trade, it reinforces broader multipolar trends in global politics. Economic self-determination strengthens negotiating power across sectors, from energy to finance. For Africa, the risks are real. Transitioning away from imports requires investment, infrastructure, and policy discipline. Food security must be maintained even as protection measures are implemented. Yet many governments argue that short-term adjustment costs are worth long-term control. For the United States, the losses raise hard questions. Can American agriculture remain competitive without preferential access? Should export strategies shift from volume to value-added partnerships? How should trade policy adapt to Africa's changing priorities? What is clear is that the era of unquestioned U.S. agricultural dominance in Africa is ending. The continent's rejection is not an emotional backlash but a calculated policy shift grounded in economic strategy. Africa's message is unmistakable: food systems are strategic assets, not just markets. And America's billion-dollar loss is the price of underestimating that reality.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.